Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'll be using the Hippo Fun in the Sun stamp set by Whimsy Stamps. I think these guys are just super cute. And for this card, I'm going to share with you how to use Distress Oxide inks to blend kind of like a shoreline scene. I'm also going to show you how to save a card because after I finished the first card, I hated it. So I was able to save the card, and I'm going to show you how I did that later on in the video. I started out with a piece of Cougar Super Smooth cardstock, and it's cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I stamped the hippo using My Favorite Things Extreme Black Hybrid ink, and then I stamped him also onto a piece of Inkadinkadoo masking paper. When you're cutting out a mask, you do want to cut really close, if not right on that stamped line. That'll keep you from ending up with a white halo around the image itself. And a trick to cutting out images is to turn the paper more than you turn your scissors. That way you'll end up with cleaner cut lines. One thing I found with the Cougar Super Smooth cardstock is that it doesn't really like masks, especially if you do ink blending with any type of ink. The mask tends to tear away the paper. So the solution for that is to put your mask on your sweatshirt sleeve or your jeans or your pajama pants, whatever you might be wearing, and that'll add some lint to the back of the mask and it'll make it a little bit less tacky. So that after you do all of the ink blending or whatever and remove the mask, it's less likely to tear. The next thing I did was I took another piece of paper, and this is just regular printer paper, and I cut it down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And to create a rough edge for my shoreline, I just tore the paper. I used my 2A zig glue pen and put a little bit of glue on the very bottom edge because that was going to be the only part that I would need to stick down to my cardstock when I was doing the ink blending. The zig 2A glue pen, once it's dry, does become repositionable. You just do want to make sure that it's completely dry before you put it on your cardstock to do any of the ink blending. I put the mask in place for the hippo, and I used a piece of painter's tape so that I could mask off the top part of the card so that I could ink blend a sky. For the sky, I used Tumbled Glass Distress Oxide ink, and with the painter's tape I did the same thing. I made sure to remove some of the tackiness by putting it on the sleeve of my sweatshirt. Once I was done with ink blending the sky, I put my rough shoreline mask over the top so I could ink blend in the sand. For the sand, I used antique linen and vintage photo. And I used makeup blending brushes for all of the ink blending. With the antique linen, I did do your typical blending in a circular motion. When I brought in the vintage photo, I literally just dotted it down. I didn't move the brush back and forth or in a circular motion. I just kind of wanted to get like darker grains of sand. Once I was done with that, I did come back with the antique linen just to blend out some of the harsher grains of sand, and some of the areas got a little bit dark. Once I was done with that, I removed the rough shoreline mask and started ink blending the water for the ocean. I started with cracked pistachio and just did a little bit of that closest to the hippo. The second color I used was peacock feathers, and I took that up a little bit further. Then I put the painter's tape back in place to cover the skyline and ink blended with salty ocean, and I brought that down and started to blend that in to the peacock feathers. Once I was done with that, I did come back with cracked pistachio just to blend in a little bit more. Now as I remove the hippo mask, you'll see that he's already colored, and I didn't show you the coloring because I was not happy with that coloring, and I'm going to show you how I colored him just a little bit later. But to finish up that shoreline, I used my white gel pen and just did dots around the shoreline so it would look like foam. And then I used my Stardust Gel Pen and did a few more dots just to add a little bit of shimmer in the foam of where the waves would be breaking. I also did really light wavy stripes in the water using my Stardust Gel Pen, because sometimes when you're looking out on the water and the waves way out there, sometimes it looks like they're nice and glittery, so I thought I would add that there. One of the tricks with a Stardust Gel Pen is to barely apply any pressure to your paper when you're using it. It's a ballpoint pen, and if you put too much pressure, then the glittery gel ink has a hard time coming out. So the lighter the pressure, the better. So moving on to how I colored the hippo, I started with BV23 and put that in the areas where the shadows would be the darkest, particularly on the back side of his arm and under his chin, and on his tummy and his chest area where his arm is touching up against his side. Next, I came in with N3 to blend out the BV23 just a little bit. Then I moved on to C1 and I finished with N0. After I had his body done, I started to work on his face, and I used the same exact colors. I wanted to make sure that I had a pretty good highlight on the top of his nose. Anyway, I wanted to make sure that I had a pretty nice highlight on the top of his snout, so I left quite a bit of white space up there. And right before I brought in the N0 to fill it in, I brought in R00 and added a little bit of pink to the inside of his nostrils and then a little bit of pink on the top of his snout, so it looked like he was just kissed by the sun. Then I brought in the N0 and blended all of that out. I decided that the R00 was a little bit too light, so I brought in R20 and added that to the inside of his ears and the inside of his nostrils, and then blended that out with the N3 and the C1. To color in his nails, I just used C1. I wasn't going to try and blend that area because it was a very small area. For his trunks, I started out with YR18 and again added that in where the shadows would be the darkest. So where underneath his little floaty device is, and then on the outer edges, and then down the center, like closest to the inside of his leg. I blended that out with YR07, and I did leave a little bit of a white space so that there would be a highlight, and I filled the highlight in with YR16. So moving on to his little floaty device, the first time I had colored it, I didn't realize that it was a unicorn. I thought it was just a pony, so I wasn't paying much attention and decided that this time, since I realized now that it is a unicorn, I wanted the mane to be in rainbow colors. So I started with a bright pink and worked my way through the rainbow order for the most part. I'll be sure to have everything that I use listed in the description box below, and I'll also make sure to list out the Copic markers that I used. So after I colored in the mane, I colored in the spots on the little floaty device, but I didn't like those, so I skipped that part, and I'll show you how I fixed that a little bit later too. But to make the floaty device look more white, I did add in some warm gray shadows, and I chose the warm gray markers because they're different enough from the colors that I used to color in the actual hippo. And for the warm grays, I just did it very lightly with W1 and W0, and then I just blended out really quick with my colorless blender. When I came back and colored the dots in on his floaty the second time, I just used the same colors that I used in the unicorn mane. I just wanted them to be a lot more bright and vibrant. I did fussy cut the hippo and went around the edges to clean up any of the not so perfect cut lines with a black water-based marker. And then I adhered him in place on the front of the card. And I thought I was done, and I looked at it and decided that I hated it. But I was not going to start over because I was really happy with how I had ink blended the Shoreline and colored the hippo the second time. So I pulled the card apart very carefully, cut down the panel with the hippo, and I stamped the sentiment using VersaMark ink and embossed it with white embossing powder. Then I adhered that to a piece of black cardstock that was cut just slightly larger than the stamped and colored panel. And I adhered that to the front of a top folding A2 size note card, which is from 80-pound Neenah Solar White cardstock, and that finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.